Have you ever felt like your life is falling apart before your eyes and you can't do anything about it? For me, this feeling became a constant companion a year ago when I lost Anna. In an instant, everything that mattered disappeared. Now I feel like a shell of the person I once was. I could never have imagined it would come to this, that I would eventually return to the old family house. After everything that had happened, this was all that remained. A quiet, empty house in a small, forgotten town, just what I needed after the accident. Anna's death had shattered everything. One minute we were driving down the highway, the sun low in the sky, talking about our future. The next, I woke up in a hospital bed with no memory of the crash. They said it was a freak accident, something went wrong with the brakes. But I couldn't get rid of this nagging suspicion that something wasn't quite right, that the accident wasn't just a matter of luck. A few months later, I moved out here. The city was too full of memories, of places we used to go together, of people who knew us as a couple. Everywhere I turned, I saw Anna. It was suffocating. So I packed up what little I could and drove on out to the house my grandparents had left behind, a place I hadn't been in years. It was old and creaky, but it was mine. More than that, it was quiet. I thought that the silence could help me heal, get me away from the noise inside my head. But this quietness wasn't the peaceful one, like in nature. This was a weighted silence, as if the very breath of the house was being held in, waiting. First, I kept busy fixing things, replacing window panes, patching leaks, repairing the roof. It was clear no one had lived here in years. The town was small and mostly forgotten, a place where nothing much ever happened. The few people I ran into barely acknowledged my presence, but that suited me just fine. I wasn't looking to talk. I didn't want to explain why I was here, all alone. Days flew into another, which slipped into the next. I awoke early, then fixed whatever needed to be fixed, then took a walk around town or just sat around at the park staring at nothing. It was comfort, a routine which kept me from thinking much and kept me from dwelling over the accident or Anna. But the memories seeped through, however much I tried to shut them out. The night of that accident haunted me. I still heard the screech of the tires, felt the weightlessness as the car veered off the road. I tried to remember what went wrong, but every time I did, I slapped against a wall. There was something about that night, something I couldn't lay my finger on. And then there was Anna. I was always thinking about her, too, just how different everything was after one moment. Her face, a second before, serenely smiling. The way she looked at me when she had laughed. That was the smile that appeared every time I closed my eyes. Nighttime, the house was different. It felt colder, more incomplete. It was quiet, the sort of quiet that had been okay through the day but now seemed to press on my chest. I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, listening for something indefinable. The creaks and groans of old wood began to take on other dimensions, less the natural sounds of an aging house, more like something else. But I always pushed the thought away. It was just my imagination. It just had to be. I had not planned on staying here long, only long enough to clear my head to figure out what was to be done next. But the longer it took, the harder it became to leave. This house, with all its oddities, felt like a place in which to hide from everything. Yet, it was hard to get rid of that nagging feeling. It was watching me, just waiting for me to notice something that I hadn't seen yet. It was one evening that, the sun being low in the horizon and sending long shadows through the window, I stood in the hall, looking out over the empty fields beyond the house. There was a chill, the type that settles in your bones. I swung around and began the climb upstairs when something caught my eye. I saw my reflection in the mirror hanging by the stairs, but something about it was off. At first, I thought it was my imagination running wild, a function of grief playing tricks upon my mind. The more I stared, though, the more I noticed, this reflection was lagging, just for a second, like it was catching up with me. I blinked and looked again, and everything was normal. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. Just exhaustion. But that night, I lay awake. The image of that delayed reflection stayed with me, gnawing away at the back of my mind. And I found myself listening again, waiting for the creaks and groans, for something that didn't quite belong. For the first time since moving in, I wondered if leaving the city had been a mistake. Days in the house started to drag along, with each day seeming longer than the last. I tried reassuring myself that the incident with the mirror was absolutely nothing, the trick of light or my exhausted brain. Yet, it did not leave this disquiet feeling. It invaded my thoughts during the daytime and at night slung around my body like a heavy blanket, which one couldn't shake off. I filled most of my time with busy workhouse repairs and long walks through town. But no amount of work would rid me of the nagging feeling that things were not quite right. The house was chilly, even on bright days, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air, a sense that the house was listening. Lying in bed one night after a long day, staring up at the ceiling, I heard the old wood beams creak as the house settled, not the usual sound of old boards expanding in the cool night air, but it was rhythmic, like footsteps. I sat up and listened. The steps were faint but distinct, slow, deliberate, as if someone walked just outside my bedroom door. My heart started racing then. I held my breath, angled to hear, but the house was quiet again. Maybe it's the pipes, I told myself. Or the wind outside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. The next morning I woke up feeling like I was being watched. The house felt alive. I couldn't say it any other way. Every room held its breath in quiet expectation of something, anything to happen. The mirrors most of all started getting on my nerves. Really, I caught myself trying to avoid them so that I didn't see what stared back. Every time I walked by, I found myself turning around with the sensation that at any moment, something would be standing there that shouldn't have been. I had decided to spend my day in town, thinking the change of scenery would clear my head. The people were friendly enough yet standoffish. It was not the kind of place where anyone asked too many questions. Most of the residents were elderly, and the town itself seemed at a standstill with regards to time. I came across the small grocery store and bought a few supplies from there. I then decided to sit in the park, trying to kill some time. But even out of doors, I had the conviction that I was being followed. I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking just out of sight. It was dark by the time I got home, and that feeling of foreboding which had been gathering in my mind all day seemed to settle over the house like a storm cloud. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. They stopped right outside my door. I froze in bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't dare move. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to react. It felt like an eternity had passed before I finally forced myself up to check. I opened the door, expecting, hoping, nothing would be there. But the hall was empty, just as it had been a minute ago, though the faint light from the street lamp outside stretching through the long-paned window made the shadows on the floor even darker, more threatening. I walked down the stairs, my steps creaking on the wooden steps, and proceeded to the kitchen. The house fell silent once again, but this feeling of being watched was suddenly stronger than ever. I flicked on the light, the sudden brightness momentarily blinding me, and made my way to the counter where I had left my keys earlier that day. They were gone. I looked around confused. I knew that I had left them there. I distinctly remembered dropping them on the counter when I came in from town. I looked through the kitchen, then the living room. They were nowhere to be found. It wasn't until I went back upstairs that I found them, sitting on the hallway table outside my bedroom door. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there for several long moments staring at the keys and trying to figure out how they had gotten there. I knew that I hadn't moved them, yet there they were. My logical brain tried to create some kind of reasonable explanation, yet nothing really made any sense. Yet, there they were, seemingly placed by someone, or something. I took the keys and retreated back into my room, locking the door in the process. Unable to explain it, something was wrong. It wasn't just that the house was old and creaky, it was alive somehow, watching me. The rest of the night, in bed, I lay awake, listening for the footsteps, waiting for anything to happen. But it was quiet again, playing with me, teasing me, making me doubt my sanity. I never slept a wink. I sat down at the kitchen table finally, with my coffee in hand, but my brain refused to move on from the keys. Had I moved them in my somnambulant trance and just not remembered? Was my brain playing tricks on me? Or was something else going on which I couldn't fathom? Answers were needed. I wanted to go through the old things my grandparents had left behind. I hadn't touched most of it since I'd moved in, just boxes of old photos, letters, and other such junk that was just collecting dust year in, year out. But maybe in those boxes was an explanation for what transpired within these walls. Poring through the older boxes in the attic, I found something that I was not expecting: an old journal. It was my grandfather's. The pages were yellow from age. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, as though he had written in a rush or under stress. I flipped through its pages, my curiosity rising. What I read sent a chill down my spine. It had felt old and fragile in my hands, its yellowed pages crinkling as I carefully turned the pages. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe some clue about the house, something that could explain the strange occurrences. Yet, the more I read, the more ill at ease I became. At first, entries were normal enough. My grandfather had written about his life in the house, how he and my grandmother moved here after retiring. They wanted to get away from the bustle of the city and enjoy the quietness of this small town. But as I flipped further, the tone of the journal changed, the entries became more and more erratic, they turned frantic. He wrote about strange noises at night, much like the ones I had been hearing. Creaks in the floorboards, footsteps outside his door. At first, he chalked it up to the house settling, but over time he became convinced something more sinister was happening. "There's something in the mirrors," one entry read. "I see it sometimes, just for a second. It doesn't move the way it should. I thought I was imagining it, but now I'm not so sure. I feel like it's watching me." It was as if someone was twisting my stomach while I read the words. Too close to what I'd been through with that mirror back in the hallway, the one with that delayed reflection, something off. Had my grandfather gone through precisely the same thing? The next entries were short, disjointed, scratched down almost as if he wrote them in a panic. He had written of things moving of their own accord, of keys disappearing and reappearing in other rooms, of shadows that seemed to pursue him across rooms. "The house isn't right," he writes in one of the final entries. "I thought it was just old and creaky, but it's more than that. I feel like it's feeding off me, feeding off my fear." I closed the journal, trembling hands. The things my grandfather described, shadows, footsteps, objects moving it, was all happening to me. Was the house really feeding off of my fear? Was it alive in some way? The thought made my skin crawl. I had no idea what to do. Part of me felt a strong urge to get out, pack my bags, and be gone, never to return. Another part of me felt tied here, and it was the part that was still in mourning for Anna. As if the house had latched onto me, pulling me down its throat. The more I stayed there, the more I couldn't leave. I lay in bed that night and tried to sleep, but the words of the journal replayed over and over again in my head. Something in the mirrors. That mirror in the hallway, the way my reflection had lagged behind, just for a moment, replayed over and over in my brain. I had so convinced myself it was nothing, but now I wasn't so sure. I must have dozed off, because I remember I woke to the quiet cadence. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a jogging sound, feet pounding one after another in slow, calculated rhythm, as if someone were running just out of earshot outside my door. Of course, as I came fully awake, I realized that it was not a dream. The footsteps were real. I sat up in bed, my heart was racing. The noise got louder, closer and closer to my bedroom and into my room, then it stopped right outside the door. For a long moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen with fear, every muscle tense. The house was silent now, but the feeling of being watched suffocated me. I have never felt anything like it before, as if even the air itself turned against me. It felt like an eternity, but I forced myself up from the bed. My legs wobbly, I stumbled toward the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me didn't want to open it, didn't want to know what was waiting on the other side. But I had to. I opened the door slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway was empty. There was nothing there, no shadowy figure, no intruder. Just the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the windows and casting long shadows on the floor. But I saw it, the mirror. It was hanging where it had always hung, at the end of the hall. My reflection stared back at me, yet something about it was odd. I took another step forward, my eyes fixed upon the glass. My reflection moved with me, yet the image was slightly skewed, slightly off. And then it happened. For one swift second, my reflection didn't budge as I did move. It did hesitate only for a second, which was long enough for me to notice, and when it did catch up, it wasn't me. The face staring back at me was mine, but something within it was seriously off, sinister in a way darker than anything I had ever known. It was smiling, but not quite like a human would. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and when I looked again, everything was normal. My reflection was just me. But the smile, the hesitation, it was seared into my mind. I sprinted to my room and slammed shut the door behind me. My breath came in shallow, catching gasps, my pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what I just saw, but one thing was for certain, my grandfather had been right. There was something in the mirrors. The next morning, I couldn't dwell on anything. I had slept very little that night, and my mind just kept rehashing over and over again what I saw in the mirror. Every time I would think about it, that same chill would crawl back in my body. That smile, it wasn't mine, not really. In fact, something dark was in it, inhuman. I sat at the kitchen table, placing the journal in front of me, opening the pages to the last few entries. My grandfather described the house as if it was a living, breathing thing that watched him. He wrote about the strange happenings that got progressively worse, how the reflections in the mirrors started to show the more disturbing things. "They're not reflections," one entry said, "they're something else. Something which impersonates me." My eyes fixed on the words, my stomach doubling over. I had been having a similar sensation, but I didn't want to believe it. How could a reflection be more than just a reflection? It just didn't make any sense to me. Still, the more I tried to put it out of my mind, the more it would rear its little head that something in this house was feeding off me, just like my grandfather had written. I needed someone to talk to, and being alone here for such a long period of time, with only my thoughts and the creepy silence of the house, was driving me crazy. My head was buzzing, and I was going insane. I thought about Mark, my old buddy from the city. Since the accident, we hadn't spoken much, but if anybody could talk me down from this, it would be him. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone. Dialing his number, a couple of rings later he answered. "Daniel?" His voice came across cautious, like he didn't know what to expect from me. "Yeah, it's me," I tried to sound neutral. I need to speak to you. I think something's wrong with the house." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean? What's going on?" I hesitated, sucking in a deep breath. How could I explain this without sounding utterly insane? "I've been seeing things. Weird things. Mirrors, reflections, they're not right. And the house. It feels like it's alive. Like it's feeding off me." Another pause. I could hear Mark exhale. "Daniel, are you sure this isn't just, stress?" You have been through a lot with Anna dying. Maybe this is your mind's way of coping. I had expected that. Of course, he wouldn't believe me. I could hardly believe it myself. But to actually hear him say it drove me further into loneliness than ever before. I know how it sounds, I said, my voice tight. But it's real. Something's happening here, and I need help. Can you come? There was a long silence. Then, finally, Mark let out a sigh. All right. I'll come out tomorrow. We'll figure this out, okay? Relief washed over me. Thanks, Mark. We hung up, but the dread feeling didn't pass. It only seemed to strengthen, if anything, to know that somehow the house was fully aware that I was trying to break free from its clutches. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept active, cleaning and repairing around the house, but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I came near a mirror, I found myself wanting to turn to it, to see if the reflection was acting as it should. But I forced myself not to give in to it. I couldn't stand seeing that warped version of myself again. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, it was louder and heavier. This time, it didn't stop outside my door like it had before, it went down the hallway and into the living room. I lay in bed, frozen with fear, as the creaking sounds of furniture shifting reached my ears. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I got up, took the nearest heavy thing, a flashlight, and slowly began to creep down the hall. The house was dark, the only light coming from the inchoate glow of the street lamp outside. As I went into the living room, the air was colder, heavier. It was as though the house was pressed in from all sides upon me. The furniture had been moved, chairs turned away from the table, the couch pulled out of place. A cold shiver ran up my spine. Who could have done it? There was no one else in the house. I walked to the big mirror hanging on the wall of the living room, and my heartbeat quickened. I didn't want to look. I knew I could see something that I couldn't explain, something that I really wouldn't want to understand. But then, again, my curious mind had gotten the best of me. I took a deep breath and looked into the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, as it should. I let out a sigh of relief, but only for a moment. In stepping closer, something in the corner of the mirror shifted, just a flicker of movement. I whipped my head around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. When I turned around and caught a glimpse of the mirror again, he was there, this time smiling. That same twisted smile I had seen the night before. But this time, it didn't stop there. He slowly raised his hand and waved at me. I dropped the flashlight and fell backwards with my heart racing. He continued to wave while I stood still, paralyzed in my fear. I burst out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind was reeling, my body trembling. What in the name of hell was going on? What had I just seen? I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. The house was alive, my grandfather had known it, and now I did too. But it got worse, I couldn't leave. Something was keeping me here, something inexplicable. And now, I wasn't so sure I'd ever get out. Mark arrived the next day, just as the morning fog began to lift. From the window, I watched his car pull up the driveway and, for the first time in days, felt this odd welling of relief. I hadn't told him everything, how could I? But here he was, a tangible presence, enough to make the house feel a little less oppressive. He smiled at me as I opened the door, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Pissed and worried about me, that was for definite, but he tried to hide it. "Daniel," Mark said, clapping me on the back as he stepped inside. "You look like hell." I managed a weak smile. "Yeah, I haven't been sleeping much." It was the same room I had seen my reflection wave back at me from in. I didn't turn toward it, for fear that something else would greet me instead. I explained to Mark the strange things that happened in the house. He listened at first with a raised eyebrow, his skepticism patently obvious. He was a practical, logical man, always the voice of reason, there to talk me down from any wild ideas. But the longer I spoke, the more I described, he listened, the footsteps and shifting shadows, the mirror. And his expression changed. He wasn't convinced, not yet, but neither was he laughing. "Look," he said, leaning forward, "I get it. You have gone through a lot, and this house. Well, it is hardly the coziest place. I'm sure it feels off, but it doesn't mean something supernatural's going on. Houses like this are old. Creaky. Weird stuff happens." I knew he was trying to help, to offer a rational explanation. Still, in his eyes, I saw that he did not believe what he was telling me. After all, not after what I'd told him. "Mark, I am not delusional," I said, coming out a bit sharper than I had intended. "I've seen things that just don't make sense. I saw myself in the mirror, but it wasn't me. It waved at me, Mark. It smiled." Mark's face hardened, his skepticism gave way to concern. "Okay," he said more slowly. "I'll stay for a few days. We'll figure this out, all right? Maybe you've just been alone too long. Maybe there's an explanation." He was trying to reassure me, but I could see the unease creep into his eyes. I wasn't sure if he was more worried about me or the house. That night, we were in the sitting room, the density of tension palpable. Mark insisted that we stay awake for some time, as if to keep each other company would keep at bay whatever was out there. We talked, but it wasn't like anything significant was being said, just merely trying to sustain a conversation. But a feeling crept over me that we were not alone. At one point, the conversation went off, and we sat in complete silence. All that could be heard was the creak of the house from time to time, making its customary adjustments in settling. Mark opened his mouth to suggest that we were off to bed when we heard it. A faint sound originated from the hallway. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but louder, clearer. Footsteps. Mark turned to me, his face pale. "What was that?" I swallowed hard as my voice caught in my dry throat. "The footsteps." We were both on our feet in a second, our bodies tense. The footsteps sounded slow, deliberate, closer. Mark reached into his bag and pulled out a flashlight. He clicked it on, and the beam sliced through the dark hallway. He took a step forward, but I caught his arm. "Don't," I whispered. "It's not going to stop." But Mark was the kind who, regardless of what had happened so far, did not back down. He shook off my hand and stepped into the hallway, the beam of his flashlight jigging down the length of the floor. Now the steps had stopped, but the air was thick with an oppressive weight, the sense that the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. I remained behind, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to see whatever it was that was making those sounds. I didn't want to know. But Mark had already headed deeper into the hallway, his flashlight cutting across the walls. "There's nothing here, Daniel," he called back, his voice taut. "It's just..." Before he could even finish, the flashlight flickered. For just a second, the beam dimmed, and then everything went dark. "Mark!" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer. I could have sworn that a cold breeze whooshed past me, as if some unseen force had cut through the room. My hands were shaking as I stumbled toward the hallway, my eyes straining to make out anything in the darkness. The house seemed to close in on me, the walls pressed in too near, and the air was too heavy. And then I saw it. A shadow moved at the far end of the hall, too large, too misshapen to be Mark. It was tall, its form shifting and writhing as it glided along the wall. My breath caught in my throat. It was heading toward Mark. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. Mark whirled, the flashlight sputtering back to life in time to catch the shadow before it disappeared. His face was white, his eyes wide with terror. He ran toward me, almost falling over his own feet as he reached the living room. "What the hell was that?" he gasped, his chest heaving. I didn't have any explanation. The house was silent once more, the shadow gone but the feeling of dread still there. Mark wasn't a skeptic anymore. His eyes betrayed the fear inside him. "Something's wrong with this place," he murmured low. "This is not just your imagination, Daniel. There's something here." I nodded, my mouth dry. I knew that for quite some time now, but to hear that from another person, too, made it a reality in ways it hadn't until then. The night remained, we sat in absolute silence, too afraid to sleep, too afraid even to move. The house was quiet, but the tension was unbearable, like a storm waiting to break. And for the first time, I realized that perhaps we weren't just dealing with the house. Maybe it was the other way around. The house was dealing with us. Neither Mark nor I slept that night. Every creak, every groan of the house felt like a threat about to pounce, something just out of sight, waiting for us to drop our defenses. We were exhausted by morning but too wired to sleep. Mark looked like he'd seen a ghost, and though he didn't say so, I knew he was wondering if we should be staying in the house at all. I was wondering it too. But going didn't seem an option anymore. The house had its hooks in me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, it wouldn't let me go that easily. Mark suggests calling somebody who could help us out. That's when I remembered Sophie Adler. Sophie wasn't a stereotypical ghost hunter or paranormal investigator, she was an academic person who studied unexplained phenomena with a scientific mind. I'd read an article that she had written years ago about the psychological impacts of trauma and how it sometimes could manifest itself in paranormal experiences. I wasn't sure she'd believe us, but I was desperate for answers, and Mark agreed that we had nothing to lose. I called her, trying to describe the situation without sounding utterly insane. Much to my surprise, Sophie wrote back promptly, agreeing to come out the next day. She was curious, intrigued even by the explanation. And while I wasn't convinced she could help, at least the fact that someone would listen gave me a degree of relief. When Sophie arrived, I was struck by how different she was from what I'd expected, young, perhaps in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. There was no dramatic flair to her, no talk of spirits or demons, just a quiet curiosity that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, she could help. Mark and I welcomed her at the front door. After a brief introduction, we invited her inside. She took an instant to take in the wall and furniture surroundings around her. It was as if she was trying to feel out of place. There was a calmness to her that belied the tension Mark and I were feeling. "So," she said, sinking into the couch in the living room with her notebook. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." We explained it all, the footsteps, the shadows, the mirror. Mark told her about what he had seen the night before, that shadow which moved in towards him in the hallway. I told her about the journal that I had found, of my grandfather's experiences, and how they mirrored what was happening to me now. She listened attentively, never interrupting, making jottings now and then. When we'd finished, she closed her notebook, sat in silence for a moment, her brow furrowed. "This is very interesting," she said finally, in a low, modulated tone. "It does happen, that people can report some very strange phenomena, following the trauma of a death, for example. But this she gestured around the room. This seems different." Mark shifted forward in his chair. "What do you mean, different?" Sophie leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "The things you're describing, footsteps, objects moving, strange reflections in mirrors, these are common in cases of what we call residual hauntings. It's as if the house itself is replaying events from the past, like a tape on a loop. But that's not all that's happening here." She turned, her eyes darting toward the hall and the hanging mirror. "There's an energy in this house, something more active. It's not just replaying events. It's interacting with you." I swallowed hard as the weight of her words sank in. "What does that mean?" Is the house haunted? Sophie shook her head slightly. Not exactly. It's more like the house has become a conduit for something else. It's feeding off of the energy in this place, off of you. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Feeding off me? It sounded ridiculous, yet at the same time it made some kind of crazy sense. Immediately when I moved in, the house had felt oppressive, like it was alive in some way, like it was drawing me deeper into its grip. She got up and walked toward the hallway mirror. Mark and I followed, our feet loud on the silent floor. For several seconds, she just stared into the mirror, her reflection staring back at us. This mirror, she said in a quiet voice, is very significant. It's acting as a focal point for the energy in this house. Has either of you guys noticed anything unusual when looking into it? Mark and I exchanged a look. I nodded, taking a deep breath. I have seen things. My reflection. Sometimes it doesn't look like me. It's late or it smiles when I am not. The wheels churned in Sophie's brain, though her face made no changes. I think the mirror is amplifying whatever is in the house. It's not just a reflection, something more. It's showing you what the house wants you to see. A wave of nausea rolled over, and the thought horrified me that the house was using the mirror to manipulate me to show me distorted versions of myself. What do we do? Mark asked, his voice tight with fear. Then Sophie turned toward us, and her eyes were steady. We have to face what's inside this house, but we have to be really careful. It isn't a haunting alone. It is something much worse. The house has been feeding off Daniel's grief, off the energy of this place. It will go on, getting stronger, unless we stop it. I swallowed hard, and my mind was racing. I still didn't know what it meant by confronting the house, nor how exactly we were to stop something that we couldn't even see. Still, I trusted Sophie, and if there was anyone to get us out of it, it would be her. First, Sophie said in a soft yet firm tone, we need to get a better idea of what we're dealing with. We'll be setting some equipment up to monitor all the energy coming into the house, and I really need to take a closer look at your grandfather's journal. It might take some time, but I think we can stop it. Mark and I nodded, still too stunned to utter a word. Suddenly, the house was different, it was alive, so much more alive than it had ever seemed. I could feel its presence, watching, waiting. It wasn't going to let us go easily. As Sophie rigged her equipment, something crystallized in my mind with a chilling clarity. The house wasn't just feeding off me. It was waiting for something, just waiting for the right time. Sophie spent most of the day setting up her equipment, motion sensors, cameras, EMF detectors that, she explained, would help track any fluctuations in energy. Mark and I tried to help, but the truth was, we were both on edge. The house seemed different now, more charged, like it was aware of what we were doing. By the time Sophie was done, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the windows. She turned to us, smearing a bit of dust off her hands. Everything's in place. Now we wait. I didn't know what we were waiting for, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. But Sophie seemed unfazed, eerily calm in fact, which somehow reassured me. Mark was nervous though. I saw him shifting around in his chair, his eyes flicking nervously every minute or so toward the mirror over the hall as if he half expected something to pop out of it at any second. The three of us sat in the living room in silence. The weight of the house pinned us down, and the air was heavy, almost thick to breathe. Every creak in the floorboards, every soft groan in the walls, made me jump, while Sophie just sat still and unstirring. It was about midnight when the first sign came. The motion sensor down the hall beeped a low but unmistakable sound that straightened us all up in our chairs. Sophie peered at her gear, face impassive. Something's moving. Mark and I looked across at each other, the tension sudden between us. The beeping kept going, slow and steady, like something pacing up and down the hall. My stomach dropped. I knew those footsteps. I'd heard them plenty of times. Sophie stood, motioning for us to follow her. We obliged and walked out into the hall. With every step, the air around us grew cooler and cooler. The second I stepped into that hallway, I felt something in the air. The air was thick with something which could not be seen. It was almost as if we had walked right into another world, one in which the laws of reality were not in place. And then I saw it. The mirror at the end of the hall. Something was wrong with it. The glass seemed darker, clouded, and as I got closer, I realized why. There were smudges on the surface, like someone had pressed their hands against the glass, dragging them down. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the reflection. It wasn't us. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at what should have been my image. The problem was that what stared back wasn't me. It was something else, something darker, more twisted. Its face was mine, but the eyes were wrong. Too dark. Too hollow. Empty. And then, just like before, it smiled. My breath caught in my throat, and I retreated a step, the weight of the house upon me heavier now. Sophie stepped forward, her face grave as she regarded the mirror. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where the energy is strongest. The mirror. It's more than just a reflection. It's acting as a portal." "A portal to where?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie didn't answer right away. She set her hand lightly on the glass, tracing the smudges with her fingers. "I don't know yet exactly," she said much more slowly now. "But it's feeding the energy inside this house. Whatever is here, whatever has been feeding from you, Daniel. It's using this mirror." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "So now what do we do?" Sophie stepped back from the mirror, her face unreadable. "We need to figure out what's on the other side. But we have to be careful. If we break the mirror without knowing what's inside it, we could make things worse." Mark's eyes went wide. "Worse? How could it get worse?" Sophie shot him a look. "Trust me, it can." She turned back to the mirror, her hand hovering just above the glass. "This mirror is acting like a door. It's letting something in, something that's been tied to this house for a long time. I've read about objects like this before, objects that hold energy, that act as conduits for things we don't understand." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I had always thought the house seemed alive in a way, in that it watched me. Now, I knew why. Mark took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, so what do we do? We can't just leave it like this." "No, we can't," Sophie said. "But neither can we rush this. If we're going to stop this, we need to do it right. We have to neutralize the mirror, but we must weaken the energy first, or whatever's inside might come through." My heart was racing as the weight of her words sunk in. Whatever this was, it was far more dangerous than we thought. And the concept of something trapped inside that mirror, just waiting to get out, began crawling up my skin. Sophie opened her notebook, flipping through the pages. "I'll have to do some research. There are rituals, ways to sever the connection between the object and the energy it's amplifying. But it's risky. We'll need to be careful." Mark crossed his arms, his face pale. "How risky?" Sophie didn't glance up from her notes. "Let's just say if we do it wrong, we could end up opening the door wider instead of closing it." My stomach nodded. I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to deal with the house or the mirror or whatever was inside it. Yet I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Sophie stood up, folding her notebook. "We'll begin tomorrow. For now, tonight, we must rest. Don't go near the mirror again. Don't say anything to it at all. The less we mention it, the weaker it will be." Easy for her to say. On our way back to the living room, I couldn't help but turn back and have another look over my shoulder. The reflection was still there, still watching. And as I turned away, I could have sworn it moved. The next morning, the house had a different feel to it. It was as if the walls themselves were bracing for something, the tension hung in the air. Sophie was up early, going over her notes and preparing more equipment. Mark and I sat in silence, the weight of what was to come hanging over us like some sort of dark cloud. It was a plan Sophie had outlined the night before: perform a ritual to sever the connection between the mirror and the entity that had been feeding off the house, and off me. The point was to weaken the energy enough that we could destroy the mirror without releasing whatever was inside it. Still, Sophie made it clear, do it wrong, and we could open the door wider than ever before, with catastrophic consequences. The night was well fallen, and it had grown much colder than it normally was. The air felt heavy and thick with the weight of what was to befall. It seemed like we were standing at the brink of something terrible, and any confrontation with what was inside the mirror made my skin crawl. Sophie ushered us into the living room at the end of the hall where the mirror faced us, its dark surface almost alive in the way it pulsed with an unnatural energy. She set candles in a circle on the floor, their flickering flames casting long eerie shadows on the walls. "We are going to perform the ritual here," Sophie said, her voice firm but steady. "This mirror is where our focus shall be. We have to get to the concentration of weakening this energy attached to the mirror." Mark was pale, his eyes darting edgily from Sophie to the mirror and back. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Sophie gave him a little, reassuring nod. "If we stay focused, it will. But we gotta be careful. The house is already reacting to us, and whatever's in that mirror, it's not just gonna let go without a fight." I swallowed hard, fighting for composure as my breathing steadied. The room felt smaller than usual, as if the house were closing in on us. Every creak of the floorboards, each flicker of candlelight was a warning. We formed a circle in which there were candles, and Sophie began to speak softly, chanting in some sort of language I couldn't recognize. These words sounded as if they were loaded, almost tangible, like they pulled something from the air and drew it towards the mirror. At first, nothing did. The house was quiet. The only sound the soft crackling of the candles. Then, gradually, the temperature started to fall. I could see my breath in front of me, and the air was thick with some heavy weight that settled in my chest. Mark shifted uncomfortably beside me, his face pale. "Is it supposed to feel like this?" Sophie didn't respond. She just kept her eyes on the mirror. She said it louder, more insistent, and repeated the ritual. And then, the house creaked. It was a low, deep sound, a sound almost of the foundation shifting beneath us. The walls seemed to shudder, and I could have sworn I felt a vibration beneath my feet, as if something was making its way through the house, pushing its way toward us. The mirror began to shake, its surface quivering like water. I stepped back, my heart racing. It was as if the air was being sucked from the room, and I gasped for breath. "Sophie." Mark's voice was panicked now. "What's happening?" Sophie's chanting was louder now, her voice steadied despite the chaos brewing around us. "Stay in the circle. Don't break the connection." But it was too late. The surface of the mirror had changed, no longer reflecting the room, now showing something else. I couldn't quite make out at first, but as I stared, I saw shapes moving in the darkness, shadows twisting and writhing, unnatural, impossible. I blinked hard, trying to make what was in the mirror come into focus, but the images shifted and changed, growing more distinct with each second that passed. And then I saw it, my reflection. But it wasn't just me. It was the twisted, smiling version of me I'd seen, standing there, watching me from the other side of the glass. The reflection waved its hand again, like it had previously. Yet this time, it was not alone. Behind it, other shadows moved, their edges clearer as they leaned against the glass, as if pushing through. I stumbled backward, my heart in my chest. "Sophie. We gotta turn it off." But Sophie didn't stop. Her voice rose louder and more desperate, the candles dancing violently, as if their flames were on the brink of being doused out by some cold wind that now swirled through the room. The house shuddered once more, this time more violently, and I could hear the sounds of furniture being tossed around in the other rooms. Something was angry furious. The shadows in the mirror grew darker, more defined, and I could feel the pull, like the mirror was drawing me in. The twisted version of me in the reflection grinned, and for a split second, I thought I saw Anna's face, her eyes hollow and empty, staring at me from the darkness. "No!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. I felt Mark's hand on my arm, yanking me back into the circle as the mirror started to crack, thin seams streaking across its surface like cobwebs. The air was electric, the energy in the room charging up with every second. "We're losing control," Mark shouted, his face pale with fear. For the first time, Sophie's voice quavered, her chant going awry, as the house bucked and heaved, the walls groaning under the stress. And then, in a loud, sharp crack, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward, and the force of it sent us all crashing to the floor. The lights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. I heard Mark gasping beside me, trying to catch his breath, and the weak, strained voice of Sophie trying to pull herself up. I turned toward the mirror, or what was left of it. The frame was empty now, the glass scattered across the floor in a million pieces. But the shadows were still there. Twisting and writhing, pulling themselves free from the shattered glass, their forms no longer confined to the mirror. "Sophie!" I gasped, trying to scramble to my feet. "What's happening?" She looked up at me, pale and drawn. The ritual. It did not work. The shadows moved toward us, slow but deliberate, their forms shifting and changing as they came closer. The air was thick with a cold, malevolent energy, and I knew then that whatever was in the mirror no longer was confined. It was free. In that moment, the world shifted. The shadows that had confined themselves to the surface of the mirror now swirled free, twisting and writhing in the air around us, no more substantial than smoke, yet there. The temperature fell even further and a cold wind cut through the room, snuffing the candles out instantly. I struggled to my feet, my body shaking with fear. Mark was beside me, his face white, his breathing in raw gasps. Sophie was still on the floor, trying to steady herself, her eyes wide with incredulity. We lost control," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing wind. The mirror was a containment, breaking it freed them. Now the shadows moved faster, swirling around us in some kind of chaotic dance. I could feel their presence, cold, oppressive, filled with a hunger that seemed to reach into the very core of my being. They weren't mere shapes or figments of our imagination. They were real, and they were coming for us. "We have to get out of here," Mark yelled, tugging at my arm. "Now!" I nodded, my heart racing, and we turned toward the door, but it was blocked by the shadows, moving like living things in a crawl across wall and floor, shifting and expanding into impossible shapes until there was no escape. I could make out strange, distorted whispers, like voices speaking just beyond the edge of my comprehension, and every instinct told me to run. Sophie was on her feet now, her face as grim as I had ever seen it. "We can't just run," she said, voice even though chaos reigned around us. "The house. It won't let us leave. Not until we deal with this." Mark stared at her like she was insane. "What do you mean, deal with this? You said the ritual would stop them, and now they're out. What do we do now?" For a moment, Sophie didn't say a word. Her eyes were fixed on the shadows as though her brain turned over ways, searching for a solution. "There's still a way," she said finally. "We have to close the doorway, the connection between the house and whatever is feeding off it. It wasn't just the mirror. The house itself is the conduit now." Her words twisted my stomach. The house. It had always felt alive, but now I knew why. It wasn't just a haunted place, it was the anchor, the gateway through which these entities had been drawn. The mirror had been one part of it, but the house had taken in that energy long ago. And now, with the mirror gone, all that was left to contain the entities was the house itself. How do we close it? I asked, voice trembling. Sophie turned to me, her face serious. We have to seal the house, the same way we tried to seal the mirror. But we need to draw the energy back in, focus it into one place. If we can do that, we can trap them again. Mark shook his head in utter disbelief. How are we supposed to do that? We just barely made it through the last ritual, and now you want us to do it all over again, with the whole house? Sophie's face was grim. We don't have a choice. If we don't stop this now, it's going to get worse. These things will spread beyond the house, find a new way to feed. Her words hung in the air, heavy with terror. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down inside, I knew she was right. Whatever had been contained within the house was now loose, and it was only a matter of time before it escaped into the world beyond. We had to stop it. It was our only choice. The shadows quivered closer, tenebrous in form yet indistinct, and malignant. I could feel them leaning against me, their cold touch like icy fingers against my skin. The house creaked and groaned, the walls seemed to shudder as if very foundations were under attack. We have to do it now, Sophie said, her voice rising in urgency. We don't have much time. Mark and I nodded, the fear tight in our chests. Sophie outlined the plan in quick strokes. We had to recreate the circle we'd used for the mirror, but this time it would encompass the whole house. We'd pull the energy down to a single point and seal it therein. It was dangerous, and if we blew it, there wouldn't be a second chance. We ripped through the house, gathering supplies, candles, chalk, salt. My hands shook as I worked, tracing floors and walls with symbols that Sophie told us to draw. The house creaked and groaned around us, the shadows grew aggressive, desperate. They pummeled the walls and rattled the windows, filled the air with those strange, unintelligible whispers. While we were preparing the ritual, I caught something out of the corner of my eye which sent a shiver down my spine. It was Anna. She was standing at the far end of the hall, beyond the reach of the shadows, her face pale, expressionless. My heart stopped. It couldn't be her. It wasn't her. But the sight of her, so familiar and yet so wrong, made my legs go weak. Anna? I whispered, my voice shaking. It didn't move. It didn't speak. Yet, as I took one step toward her, I saw it, the faint, twisted smile, the same one I'd seen in the mirror. It wasn't Anna. It was something pretending to be her, trying to draw me closer. I stumbled backward. My heart raced on. It's not real, I whispered to myself. It's not her. Sophie stepped between the figure and me, her expression sharp. Don't let it trick you, she said. It's feeding off your grief, using it against you. I nodded, forcing my gaze away. But in my head, the image of Anna persisted, staring out with her empty eyes from among the shadows. The house shook harder this time, and I felt the floor moving beneath my feet. Time was running out. Sophie lit the candles, their flames flickering to life as her hands flew to draw the final symbols on the floor. The air was thick with energy now, even the shadows seemed to press in on us from all sides. The house groaned, its walls shaking as though they were resisting what we were doing. We need to start, Sophie said, her voice tight. Everyone, in the circle. Mark and I stepped into the circle, the thumping of our hearts in the chest. Sophie began to chant, her voice was steady, yet laced with urgency. The shadows around us swirled, their form twisting and writhing as though being pulled towards the circle's center. The house shuddered, the walls groaning under the strain. I could feel the energy gathering, weighing down upon us like some physical weight. The shadows now moved quicker, swirling into a dark vortex, their whispers louder, more desperate. And then the air exploded. The air had filled with a deafening roar, the shadows piling into the circle, breaking against the walls of energy Sophie had created. The house rocked violently, and for a moment, I was sure the house was just going to collapse in on us. But Sophie's voice never wavered. She kept chanting, drawing the energy in, pulling the shadows toward the middle of the circle. The vortex was growing darker, stronger. I could feel the cold energy seep into my bones. My head spun, and my vision blurred as shadows crowded in on us from all sides. "Hold on!" Sophie shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the energy. I clenched my fists and fought to stay upright as the house groaned and shuddered around us. The shadows were being sucked in toward the center of the circle, their forms twisting and writhing as they went. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the house resisting, fighting against the ritual. And then, in one final deafening crack, the shadows just disappeared. The house had suddenly gone quiet. The silence after the roar was almost unbearable. Thick and heavy, it pressed down on us, as if the air itself was too afraid to move. For a moment, none of us dared breathe. Gone were the shadows that had filled the house, that had pressed in on us with such force. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs shaking from exhaustion. The house felt empty. That oppressive weight that had filled every room, every corner was lifted. But it wasn't a comforting emptiness. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of quiet that came right before everything collapsed. Sophie let her hands drop and swayed, her face pale and tight, her body drained from the energy she'd just expelled. But her eyes were sharp, bright. "It's done," she breathed. Mark and I looked at each other, neither one of us quite believing it. The house was quiet, yes, but after all we'd witnessed, all we'd endured, it was hard to accept that that was it, that it finally was over. "Is it really gone?" I asked, my voice was shaking. Sophie took a deep breath, her head nodding up and down in a very slow motion. "The connection has been severed. The energy that was feeding off this house, it's been drawn back, contained. But..." She suddenly stopped, her eyes scanning the room as if part of something unseen. "But what?" Mark asked, his voice tight with fear. Sophie shook her head. "The house is still here. The energy is gone, but this place. It's been a conduit for so long. I don't know what might still be tied to it. But the worst is over." I let my breath out, feeling it lighten the weight off my shoulders. The worst was over. No more shadows, no more voices, no more twisted reflections. The house still stood there, but the malignant force that had haunted me since the instant I had arrived had been driven back. For the first time since I moved in, I felt like I could breathe. Mark slumped against the wall, his hands shaking. "We have to get out," he whispered. "We can't stay in this house. Not after everything. You know?" I nodded. Of course I wanted to go. My whole body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this house as possible. But something kept me rooted on the spot, a nagging feeling that the house wasn't quite through with me yet. As we began to pack, my gaze fell into the hallway where the mirror used to be. Now its frame was empty, shattered glass littered the floor. But there weren't any shadows. Neither the contorted reflection of myself, nor Anna's ghost. It was all gone. Still, I felt this urge of uneasiness. "Sophie," I said, very softly. "Is there any chance it could come back? Whatever was in the mirror?" Sophie turned to me, her expression grave. "I don't think so. The energy that was tied to the mirror, to the house, is sealed. But this place, it's been affected for so long, there might still be residual effects. Things that linger." She was little comfort. Anything remaining in the house made my skin crawl. At least it was over now. At least we had been able to stop whatever it was trying to break through. I went around packing the last things, my mind running with thoughts. I didn't know where I was going to go, what I was to do next, but I knew I could not stay here anymore. This house had taken far too much from me, and I was out of anything else to give in return. The feeling that overcame me was finality as we approached the front door. It was just a house, an older, creakier building complete with dust and memories, but it didn't feel like home. It never had. Mark was the first to step outside, anxious to be free of the place. Sophie followed him, her footsteps slow and deliberate, as if she were replaying everything that had happened. I was the last to leave. I glanced around the house once more before closing the door on my heels. The windows were dark, the walls silent. There was no movement, no whisper of shadows or reflections. Just an empty house. But as I did so and turned to leave, something drew my attention. Standing at the very rear corner of the hall, where the shadows used to collect, I saw that it was there. Just for an instant, a flicker of movement, a shape shifting in the darkness, so faint that I almost thought that I'd imagined it. Still, it was there. It wasn't quite through with me yet. We then drove away in complete silence, with the weight of all that we had just experienced hanging over us like a storm cloud. The house receded into the distance, but the feeling that something was still watching, still waiting, stayed on with me. Sophie said the connection had been severed, but I wasn't quite as convinced. In its own way, the house had lived off my grief, my fear. And though we'd put an end to whatever was inside the mirror, I knew deep down that the house itself would never be at rest. Mark dropped me off at a small motel on the edge of town. He didn't say much, the look in his eyes said it all. He was scared for me, and scared because of what we had faced. I didn't blame him, I was scared too. Sophie hung behind a moment as Mark disappeared up the stairs. She turned to me, her eyes soft with compassion. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "Leaving the house. Some places. They're just too bruised to ever be whole again." I nodded, though her words did little for the tightness in my chest. Do you think it's really over?" Sophie was silent for a moment, far away with her gaze. "The worst of it is," she finally said. "But some things. They leave scars." She didn't say anything more before she went, and I was glad for that. There was nothing left to be said. I had stood in front of the motel for so long, watching the sunset. The house was far away behind me now, but it was still with me, clinging to my mind like a dark stain. I would probably never be free of it, never able to forget the shadows which had followed me, the reflection that hadn't been mine. I wasn't sure. But for now, I was out. And that was enough. For now.